Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from University of Central Florida, and I'd like to introduce some theories related to law and social control for the CJL 6568 Law and Social Control course. The interesting feature about law is that there's so many debates. There's, interpretations that vary. There's changes. There's cross-cultural comparisons. There's comparisons within and between states and jurisdictions. And all the time I hear people saying there should be a law, XYZ, or it's against the law, it may be, maybe not. I'm often amazed what is considered legal and illegal in different contexts and situations. I enjoy this course from my sociological background, where I try to make sense of the legal system and the law and the applications of laws and how they change, and the cultural lags and a lot of the more recent technological features that someone like myself, a middle-aged, grumpy old man, would have never dreamed would be possible. Some of you may remember the days before we had computers, and we had those pagers and the tape recorders to dictate our case notes, and then a transcriptionist would type them up, and 2 or 3 days later we'd sign, and things moved much, much slower, and we used mail. I actually still sometimes, I have some stamps here, but I don't mail out stuff that often anymore. It's all email generated, or it all occurs online with who knows what going on as far as credit cards and transactions and all that. So, why do we have laws? Getting kind of to the beginning of things, we know that laws have been around as long as people have, but the general idea here, taking more of a sociological perspective, is the big question is, how do we secure conformity? Laws come about because people realize that in order to get along, to have some stability in society, to progress, to avoid conflicts, and to avoid many problems, we have laws. I mean, obviously, traffic laws, are a great example. That we have a lot of traffic laws, and we know a lot of people obey them, and thousands of cars are able to move smoothly. And we know that some don't obey the laws, and sometimes with disastrous consequences. But the structural functional approach looks at the idea of reinforcing values and norms and rules for resolving conflict. So we have these laws, and if everyone knows the laws and people follow those rules and regulations and they become norms, then we move toward an integrated society that's peaceful and low in conflict, and you get kind of, and this idea is based on some of the earlier work of Emile Durkheim and Talcott Parsons, famous sociologists, and they talked about how the structure of the law is related to the consequences, the functions that it carries out. For example, some of the functions are order, to resolve conflict, to also allow appropriate release of emotions, for justice, and to promote values. Of course, there may be dysfunctions, and that gets to the next perspective, which is the conflict or critical model from sociology, where there's a view that there's a lot of conflicts, whether it be class, gender, race and ethnicity, age, region, that we have these problems that occur because there's too much social control. And the interesting feature here, in looking at the conflict perspective on the one hand and the structural functional perspective on the other hand, is that the structural functionalists believe that problems occur when there is not enough social control, and the conflict theorists believe that problems occur when there's too much social control. And the idea is that if there's too much social control, people suffer alienation. If there's not enough social control, there's anomie. Both perspectives saying basically that there's all kinds of chaos and problems and distress and disorder, depending on if you have the view that too much social control leads to problems or not enough social control leads to problems. And of course, many would say, well, actually a balance is probably more appropriate here. Too much social control certainly would lead to problems, and so would not enough social control. And that perhaps there needs to, or the balance seems to be the one that leads to less anomie and less alienation. I kind of use a family therapy model called a circumplex model, where balance seems to be related to better functioning, whether it's families or societies. And then we have Max Weber, well-known sociologist who looked at power, or the idea of getting others to do things. Basically that they may not want to do. That you may ask people, well, how would you like to drive? How fast would you like to go? What would you like to wear? What would you like to do here? And would you like to get your meal and not have to pay for it, or decide for yourself how much? And everyone would have different views and opinions, but then there's laws that say you have to carry out procedures in a certain way. Sometimes this whole idea of power may be viewed as legitimate or illegitimate power, and gaining authority is also seen by Weber, occurring in three major ways: through tradition, charisma, or legal rational. I was once talking to someone, and we were talking about our exposure to secondhand smoke in the city where we live, and they were saying, well, can't we just ban it? Can't we just make it illegal to have secondhand smoke exposure or smoking in the public streets? And I looked into the laws regarding this, and the cities cannot pass ordinances banning smoking in Florida. It has to come from the state. And the state hasn't done that or won't do it. So people are allowed to smoke in public. So, the interesting thing is that I said, it would be interesting, though, if we, just started telling people, saying, on the street, saying, when they're smoking, saying, hey, you know what? It's illegal to smoke here. You're going to get fined. I'm telling you to beware. And then they stop smoking. And you keep doing that, and other people tell people. The next thing you know, you've created a false law. And my friend said, but isn't that against the law to make up a law and tell people that? That's a lie. And I said, well, yeah, but I don't know if it's against the law to tell people that something the law that's not the law. Regardless, you can see where I'm going with this. Would people comply? And then the city ended up having a voluntary smoke-free area at certain restaurants. And voluntary smoke-free is an interesting term itself. And when I discussed this with the press, it just didn't come out right. I guess because I was being a little bit too sociological and trying to overinterpret things. And I said, well, how can you have this is a voluntary smoking, non-smoking area, but people can smoke there. It's because it's voluntary. But this non-smoking, they're not allowed to smoke there. So a lot of times there's a lot of misinterpretations. Many of you in law enforcement and corrections probably have to deal with this every day, especially in law enforcement, when people interpret the law for you in different ways. And because you've been doing this for a while, that's just not the case. They said, well, it's illegal. This person did this. And you say, well, no, it's actually not illegal. Sometimes we see that with certain scenarios where citizens will say, it's illegal for that person to do that. And the law enforcement officer says, well, actually, it's not. They have not, broken any laws. Well, it should be. And so on and so forth. Interesting features there. Donald Black really brought in an interesting view in his earlier work, The Behavior of Law, and some of his more recent work, which you'll read about on terrorism in one of your textbooks. But he looked at law as a quantitative variable and different styles of law related to punishment, payment, resolving conflict, and treating those with problems. So, and you can look over the overhead or I'm sorry, the PowerPoints on Donald Black to get just a brief overview, and then you'll get more of that in the textbook. Fascinating. I like Donald Black's work because it comes from a perspective totally opposite of the one I take, and it's good. And I like to challenge it, but it's a really good approach. And so I think that also is helpful when you have all these approaches and you can start critically evaluating them. And he has a variety of propositions related to his model, such as law varies directly with respectability, law varies inversely with other social control, and so on and so forth. Other schools of law, economic, interpretive, feminist, narrative, postmodern. And then the whole idea again about what drives, why do people obey the law? What leads to laws being successful? What leads to legal reform? And Friedrichs, in his book Laws in Our Lives, talks about some of those issues related to legal reform, such as a growth in societies, different economic systems developing. Certainly our new technologies, and we'll spend several weeks on that. New social conditions, moral entrepreneurs who kind of create panics or decide that things should be a particular way based on their morality codes. Special interest groups. Whoa, you know as well as I do, right now it's election time, and I had to turn off the phone ringers because people are calling me, machines and real people. And sometimes I really can't tell the difference anymore. Calling me to recommend that I vote for someone for no apparent reason other than the person ringing against them is worse. So I don't know. Certainly I haven't heard any science presented regarding what they're supporting or not. So of course I'm not going to get into politics. And public interest. Public interest is an interesting feature as well. I try to stay out of the local and national political debates and all that. As a scientist, though, sometimes I'll say something, but I always like to preface that with based on the research. And then so and so and so and so, and that's kind of a different situation, but we'll see not all the time. That, in other words, we'll see that science has an interesting relationship with politics, and we'll address that later. Narrative analysis, I think, is kind of interesting, where we look at law as storytelling, and if you think about trials, for example. Some of you may spend some time in court testifying in your cases. I spent a lot of time in court in my early years when I worked as a mental health counselor. One thing I would say, though, I probably spent more time waiting to testify than actually in the courtroom when I worked for a state-funded program, because my pay was, I think, $7 an hour I would get. And then when I worked for a private practice, and they could charge whatever they want, it was interesting. You go into the courtroom right away at a certain time, and you're out of there as quickly as possible. So economics drove that, which was kind of interesting, how long I spent in court, in the courthouse, that is. And then we get to the whole idea of social control, and we'll see some definitions of that and different types of social control. And one of your textbooks, Social Control and Introduction by James Criss, second edition, I really like this because it goes over in great detail a variety of different types of social control and applies it to some different scenarios and in more detail. And so I think, that's kind of nice to get that. And then this is a book I'm using the first time in this course, Windows into the Soul by Gary Marks, Surveillance and Society in an Age of Technology. This is all about surveillance and technology and society. And I just picked this book up probably about a month ago, decided to use it in the course. The previous book I was using on an analysis of the Salem witchcraft scenarios is no longer in print. So I'm changing books, and this is going to be, I think, a lot of fun. This is going to be, well, fun. Yeah, they're going to be fun, I think. Just don't tell anyone, that you're having fun reading your books and taking the Law and Social Control course. I'm going to have more material online for you, PowerPoints, links. I'll be making some more of these videos, which is kind of interesting because in the classroom, I have a lot more control over my rambling. I can say, well, to summarize, and then spend 20 minutes, as long as we still have that time in the classroom. Here, you all have a lot more control, social control. Actually, you have mouse control, fast forward control, delete control, replay control, and so on. So it's kind of interesting. I can ramble on, and you could fast forward through ramblings, or if I say something that you want to hear again, you can obviously go back and hear it again. So this new methodology gives the students, I think, a lot more control. And of course, if you don't want to look at my big head, you can still listen to it and, have the screen on pleasant mountain scenes or rivers or something like that. So welcome to the course. Again, I think the key here is that we're exploring a lot of new domains as well as historical, and to look at these connections and really try to put a lot of the pieces together, realizing that a lot of times we're going to come up inconclusive or with contradictory and conflicting results. So welcome to the course.